I want to say first that I kept every log the way I was trained to keep it, in blue ink, block capitals, the date underlined twice. Because a thing written in pencil can be erased, and a thing written in cursive can be doubted. And I am telling you this now, before I tell you anything else, so that when you reach the end of what I have to say, you will understand that I was not a careless man. Whatever happened up there on Sifton Ridge did not happen because I stopped paying attention. If anything, it happened because I paid too much of it. I was the kind of man who noticed, who could not walk past a crooked picture without straightening it, or hear a clock a half second out of true without feeling it in my teeth. And the Ridge, I have come to believe, has a particular appetite for men who notice. It does not want the careless ones. The careless ones would never find what there is to be found up there. The careless ones would sleep through the whole slow business of it and drive back down the fire road in October none the wiser. And the Ridge lets them go, I think, the way a fisherman throws back what is too small to keep. It waited for a man like me. It has been waiting for men like me for a long time. The station sat at the top of a fire road 11 miles from the last paved surface. A two-story timber frame lookout with a garage bay bolted onto the north side and a catwalk running the full circumference of the second floor. From up there on a clear day, you could see 4 counties and, on the very clearest, the gray suggestion of mountains in a fifth. And the whole point of the place, its reason for existing, was that a man could stand on that catwalk and see smoke before anyone else in the world saw it. Could see the first thin thread of it rising off some distant ridge and put a bearing on it with the Osborne firefinder and call it down to the district office before it became the kind of thing that eats a town. That was the job, to watch, to be the eyes of a country too big to watch itself, and to be those eyes alone from the middle of April to the first hard snow, which in that part of the country could come as early as October or hold off, sulking, until the week before Christmas. When the service hired me, they told me all this the way you would tell a man about a medical procedure, laying out the isolation as a thing to be endured rather than enjoyed. The woman doing my intake paperwork, she had reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and a way of not quite looking at you while she talked, as though she were reading your answers off a screen only she could see, told me I would have no relief crew, no visitors scheduled, that a supply run came up the fire road once a month if the weather allowed and sometimes did not, and that the nearest other human being, once I was up there, would be a voice on a radio 60 miles away. She told me this as though it were a warning, and I remember I nodded and said that was fine. I said I preferred it, and she looked at me then, actually looked for a second longer than the conversation required, and I understand now what she was doing, because I would come to do it myself, later, in a way. She was trying to read in the set of a man's face, whether the solitude was going to hold him together or take him apart. She had, I think, seen it go both ways. There was something in her stillness that had been taught to her by outcomes, and whatever she saw in my face she did not say. She only made a small mark in the corner of a form and slid the next page across, and I signed it in block of capitals with the date underlined twice, and she watched me do that too. I had reasons to want to be alone that I did not put on the application. I will get to them. A man who tells you at the start of a confession that he has nothing to be ashamed of is not confessing. He is advertising, and I am not advertising. I am trying to lay the pieces down in the order I found them, because that is the only order that makes the shape of the thing visible, and the shape is the whole point. The shape is what I need you to see. If I tell it out of order, if I give you the ending pressed up against the beginning, you will do what everyone does with a story like this. You will decide early that the man was already broken, that the ridge changed nothing, that he brought his ruin up the mountain in his own duffel bag. And there is a version of the truth that sounds like that. But it is not the whole truth, and the whole truth is stranger, and I've earned the right to tell it strangely. The first 3 weeks were clean. I want to dwell on that cleanliness for a while, because I think it matters. I think the horror of everything that came after is only measurable against how genuinely good those 3 weeks were. And if I rush past them the way I want to, out of a kind of grief for them, you will not feel the height I fell from. I woke at 5:40 every morning to a gray that came up out of the valley like water filling a basin. That was the first thing, the fog, and I never got tired of it. I would come out onto the catwalk with my coffee, and the whole world below the ridge would be gone, drowned. Nothing but a flat white sea with the tops of the far peaks standing up out of it like islands. And then the sun would come over the eastern shoulder of the ridge and hit that sea and turn it. For about 11 minutes I timed it. Of course I timed it the color of the inside of a shell. A pink so pale it was almost an idea of pink. And then the warmth would start to eat the fog from the top down, and the valley would come back into the world piece by piece. The river first, then the fire road, then the little gray clot of the nearest town 22 miles out. I logged the temperature and the wind speed and the humidity every morning at that hour. I logged the visibility in miles. There was no operational need to log the color of the fog, and so I did not log it. But I want you to know that I saw it. That I was not a man who had gone up a mountain and stopped seeing. Not then. Not yet. The coffee I made in a steel percolator that had scratched into its base, the initials of God knew how many rangers before me. I noticed that the first week and thought nothing of it. Or rather, I thought the small, warm thought you think when you find a thing like that. A sense of belonging to a long, quiet order of men who had stood where you stood. There were maybe a dozen sets of initials down there, some deep and some worn nearly smooth, and one set worn so smooth that it was less a carving than a memory of a carving. A set of grooves you could feel with your thumbnail but could not quite read. And I used to run my thumb over them while the coffee perked, the way you would worry a stone in your pocket. And I did not think then that a man does not wear initials that smooth in one season. I did not think about how many mornings of one thumb it would take to erase what another man had cut on purpose into steel. I did not think about it because I did not yet have any reason to. And that is the last kind of innocence, the kind where the evidence is already in your hand and you have not yet been given the question that makes it mean anything. I walked the catwalk clockwise, always clockwise, checking the firefinder and the antenna guys and the storm shutters and the lightning ground. And I radioed my status to the district office at 0600 and again at 1800. And between those two poles, the day hung like a hammock, and I lay in it, and I was, for the first time in a long time, something close to well. The man who took my calls at the district office was named Hollis. I never met him. I want you to understand that, because of everything I am going to tell you, the strangeness of it depends on it that the one human relationship I had for those months was a voice, a dry, unhurried, middle-of-the-country voice that came out of a speaker twice a day and said copy green and sometimes a little more. I built a whole man around that voice the way you do. I decided he was older, that he had done field seasons himself once and been moved to a desk by a bad knee or a bad heart, that he drank his coffee black and did the crossword between calls and had a photograph of grandchildren taped to the side of his monitor. None of that was based on anything. It was just that a man alone will make company out of whatever is to hand. And what was to hand was Hollis twice a day, 30 seconds at a time. You have to understand that order was not a hobby for me. It was the thing I had instead of peace. Some men pray and some men drink, and I made lists. I made systems. I made the world small enough and regular enough that I could stand inside it without shaking. I have known this about myself for a long time, and it is not a discovery I made on the ridge. When I was a boy, I alphabetized things that had no business being alphabetized. I counted stairs and ceiling tiles and the panes in a window. And when my father died, I was 19. I did not weep so much as I organized. I made the arrangements with a terrible fluent efficiency that frightened my mother, and I understood even then, at 19, that the efficiency was the grief, that I was building a scaffold of tasks around a hole so that I would have somewhere to stand that was not the edge of it. That is what my systems have always been, scaffolds around holes, a way of standing near the unbearable without falling in. My wife used to say that living with me was like living inside a Swiss watch, and she did not mean it kindly, and by the end she did not mean it at all, because she was not there to say it. I will not tell you her name yet. I have not decided whether I will tell you at all. It feels some days like the last thing I have that the ridge did not take, the last entry that is not in the pad, and I am reluctant to spend it. But I will tell you this much now, and the rest later in its place. She was sick, and I kept a record of it. And the record is the whole reason I am the kind of man the ridge wanted. And when I have laid the other pieces down, I will lay that one down too, and you will see how it fits. You will see that it was always the keystone. So when I tell you the first 3 weeks were clean, I am telling you they were the best weeks I had had in 2 years. Up there with the percolator and the fire finder and the twice underlined dates, I had built the smallest, tightest, most defensible world of my life, and I believed, God help me, that I had finally gotten far enough away from everything to be safe. I thought distance was the thing. 11 miles of fire road past the last pavement, 60 miles of static between me and the nearest voice, 4 counties of empty air I could see across and no one to see me. I thought a hole could not follow a man that far. I did not understand yet that the hole I was standing near had never been in the world behind me. I had carried it up in my chest the whole way, and the ridge did not need to bring me anything. It only needed to give me a quiet enough place to finally look down into what I had already brought. The steno pad changed that, though it took me a while to understand that it had. I found it on the 9th of May. I remember the date because it was the first day the radiator in the downstairs room stopped working. And because I write down everything, and because it is, I have come to think the true beginning of my life, or the true end of it, and a man remembers the hinge his life turns on even when he would give anything to forget it. The downstairs room was where the heavy equipment lived, the spare batteries and the fuel for the generator and a workbench, and the bulky old cast iron radiator that fed off the generator's heat exchanger, and it had gone cold in the night, and I had gone down after my morning circuit with a flashlight and a socket wrench to see whether I could get at the bleed valve. The floor down there was old tongue-and-groove fur that had gone soft in one corner from a roof leak that some ranger 3 or 4 tenants back had patched, but not perfectly. You could see the patch on the ceiling, a lighter square of newer shingle felt, and below it the stain had spread into the boards, and the boards had drunk it and swelled, and then, over years, dried and gone punky. And I remember thinking, with the small professional disapproval of a man who would have patched it right, that whoever did that job had done it in a hurry, had done it to stop the water and not to fix the floor, and I remember wondering what had made him hurry. When I knelt on the soft place, a board gave under my knee with a sound like a knuckle cracking. Not broken, just loose, sprung up at one end from a nail that had let go. The head of the nail lifting proud of the wood by a 1/4 inch, and I am the kind of man who cannot leave a sprung board sprung. It is not even a decision, it is closer to an itch. So I worked my fingers under the lip of it and lifted, meaning to reseat it, to knock the nail back down and be done. And the board came up further than I expected, all the way up, the tongue sliding out of the groove of its neighbor with a dry sigh, and underneath, lying flat on the dust and the mouse droppings and a wad of pink insulation gone gray with age, was a steno pad. Green cover. The spiral at the top, the way the reporter's pads are made. So you flip the pages up and over rather than to the side. It was swollen with damp the way paper gets. The cover curled back on itself in a slow, permanent wave. And when I picked it up, it had that smell. That specific smell of old paper that has been closed in the dark for a long time. A smell like a library and a basement, and something faintly organic underneath, sweetish. The smell of things very slowly returning to the ground they came from. And I want to be honest and tell you that my first feeling was not dread. I have gone over this moment more times than any other, trying to find in it some early warning I ignored, some cold hand on the back of the neck, and there was none. My first feeling was pleasure, clean, uncomplicated pleasure, because here was a record. Here was a document left by a man who had done my job before me in my station. And I have already told you what I am, a man who trusts what is written, who feels toward a well-kept log something close to what other men feel toward scripture, and finding another man's logbook felt in that moment like finding a letter from a friend I had not yet met. I even smiled. I knelt there on the cold floor with my breath showing, and I smiled down at it. And I have thought since that if the ridge has a face, that is the moment it smiled back. I did not fix the radiator. I want you to notice that. I had gone down there with a purpose, with a task, with a system, and the pad dissolved the system in one instant, and I set the socket wrench down on the punky board, and I never picked it up again, and the radiator stayed cold, and for the rest of my time on the ridge, the downstairs room was a cold room, and I heated the upstairs with a kerosene stove and told the district office the radiator was beyond field repair, which was true, though not for the reason I gave. The first thing the pad took from me was a repair, a small thing, the smallest thing. But that is how it worked, always. From the very first, it did not take my sanity in a single grab. It took it the way the sun took the fog, from the top down. A repair, and then a routine, and then a rule, and then, at the last, everything. I took it upstairs. I made fresh coffee, though I had already had my morning cup, because reading wanted its own coffee, and I sat at the desk under the west window where the light would come in long and amber in the evenings. Though it was still morning then, and the light was thin and gray and honest, and I opened the steno pad, and the first thing I noticed was the handwriting, because the first thing I always notice is the handwriting. It was mine. Now I want to be very careful here, because this is the place where a lesser account would reach for the easy word, would say identical or exactly the same as mine, and I am not going to do that, because it was not exactly my handwriting, and the difference is the whole of what I have to tell you. It was my handwriting, the way your own voice on a recording is your voice, recognizably, undeniably, sickeningly yours, and yet wrong, yet carrying some quality you never hear from the inside and cannot quite name and do not want to. The block capitals were mine. The particular way I let a capital R throw its leg out to the side, mine. The double underlined dates were mine, and I had told no one about the double underline. No living person. It was a private tick, a thing I did because a single line under a date can be mistaken for a stray mark of the pen, but two lines cannot be mistaken for anything but intention. And I had never explained that reasoning aloud to anyone, had never seen another human being do it, had come to think of it, in the mild vanity of a solitary man, as a small signature of my mind. The number sevens were crossed the way I cross my sevens, the little bar through the stem that I picked up from a foreman I worked under one summer and kept the rest of my life. The lowercase g's, on the rare occasions the writer dropped out of block capitals into ordinary script, had the same open tail I have never in 50 years been able to close. And the dates ran from the middle of April to the first week of May of a year I could not account for. That was the thing I fixed on first, because it was the thing my orderly mind could get its hands around. The ink was old, not ancient, not sepia, but old. Gone the flat grade blue that blue ink goes when it has sat in the dark for years. And the paper was old, soft and foxed and swollen. And the pad had lain under that floor long enough for the damp to work through it, and the mice to nest in the insulation around it, and for the whole object to become part of the archaeology of the room. And yet the entries, whatever their age, were the entries of a man doing exactly what I was doing, in exactly the way I did it, in the exact season I was living through at that very moment. Middle of April to the first week of May. I had arrived on the 14th of April. It was the 9th of May. His record and my life had begun on nearly the same day and had run side by side. His some unknowable number of years in the past, mine in the humming present, like two trains on parallel tracks pulling out of the same station at the same hour bound for the same place. And I was reading the schedule of the one ahead. I told myself the obvious thing. I am proud, in a small, bleak way, that I told myself the obvious thing. That I did not leap straight to the abyss. That I gave the daylight explanation its full and fair hearing first. Because it means that when I finally crossed over into believing the other thing, I crossed for reasons and not for want of imagination. I told myself that rangers are trained the same way, that the service teaches the log format in a 2-day orientation with a laminated example card, that block capitals and underlined dates and crossed sevens are not the signature of my particular soul, but the house style of a whole profession, and that I was flattering myself, indulging the loneliness that magnifies everything, to think these marks personal. I told myself that the double underline was surely more common than I believed, that I had simply never had occasion to compare logbooks with another ranger, that in a filing cabinet somewhere at the district office, there were 40 years of these pads all double underlined and crossed sevened, and I would find, if I ever saw them, that my private signature was the common tongue of every watchman who ever kept this post. And there is enough truth in all of that. There truly is to have let me close the pad and go back down and fix the radiator and live out my season and drive down the fire road in October, a slightly lonelier and more superstitious man, and nothing worse. And I want you to notice that I did not close the pad. I want you to notice that already on the 9th of May, on the very first morning, with every reasonable explanation lined up neat and persuasive in my head, some part of me, the noticing part, the part the Ridge was fishing for, had quietly decided that the more frightening explanation was the more interesting one, that I would rather stand at the edge of the hole and look down than back away from it and be safe and bored, and that part of me turned the page. It has occurred to me since that this is the truest thing about me, truer than the systems, truer than the grief, and that the Ridge did not corrupt it but only used it the way you would use any tool for the job it was made for. That given the choice between a comfortable lie and a terrible truth, I will always, every time, reach for the truth. Not because I'm brave, but because the lie itches. Because an unexamined thing sits in me like the sprung nail sat proud of the board, and I cannot leave it. That is not a virtue. I used to think it was a virtue. Up on that ridge, I learned what it is. It is the thing that empties a man out. It is the reason I am the last handwriting in the pad. The early entries were mundane in a way that reassured me and unsettled me at the same time. And I need you to feel both halves of that, because the doubleness never left. Not for one entry, not for one day. Every single thing the pad ever showed me was at once perfectly ordinary and perfectly impossible, and the mind cannot hold those two together for long without beginning to fray at the join. O, 600 status green, VIS, 40 miles, wind SW8, radiator downstairs temperamental, bled valve holding. And I sat there with the flashlight still hooked in my belt from the radiator I had gone down to bleed and abandon not 40 minutes before. And I read a man complaining about the same radiator in the same room with the same word temperamental, which is my word, which is a word I use. A slightly fussy old-fashioned word my mother used about the oven, and I inherited from her without ever choosing it. And I told myself again, doggedly, that a radiator that is going to fail will fail the same way for every man. That cast iron does not care whose season it is. That this was mechanics and not prophecy. And that is true. That is completely true. And it did not help at all, because the truth of it ran alongside the impossibility of it without touching it. 2 trains on 2 tracks, and I could ride either one and the other was always there in the window. Page after page of it. Oh, 600 status green, 1800 status green, VIS 40 miles, VIS 35 miles, haze off the valley, wind calm, restocked kerosene, generator running rough at startup, smoothed after 5 minutes, logged for supply run. The tidy shorthand of a man keeping his world small and tight and defensible. And I recognize the impulse in every line the way you recognize your own reflection, moving in a dark shop window when you did not expect a mirror there. That lurch, that half second where you take yourself for a stranger, and then the stranger resolves into you, and the recognition is worse than the fright had been. He restocked the kerosene the way I restocked it. He logged the generator's rough startup for the supply run the way I would, 3 days later, logged the identical thing, because the generator did run rough at startup and did smooth after 5 minutes, and I did note it for the supply run. And by then, I had read that he had done so, and I could no longer tell whether I was recording a fact or performing a script, and that uncertainty, that specific poison, entered me early and never drained out. Then, on what would have been the 22nd of April by his dating, the entries changed. Not dramatically. That is the thing I keep coming back to. The thing I most need you to understand about the whole descent. That nothing on the ridge ever announced itself. That there was never a moment you could point to and say, here, this is where it turned strange. Because it was strange all along and it never stopped being ordinary. And the change on the 22nd was so small that a careless man would have read straight over it. But I was not a careless man. I have told you that. The entry for the 22nd read, 600 status green. Vis 40 miles. Wind calm. Walked the catwalk counterclockwise this morning. No reason, felt wrong the whole day. I read that line 4 times. I know it was 4 because I counted. And I counted because counting is what I do when the floor tilts. It is the oldest scaffold I have. From the stairs and the ceiling tiles and the panes of my boyhood. And I stood at the edge of the hole and I counted my way along the plank of that sentence 4 times. I read it 4 times because I have never once in my life walked that catwalk counterclockwise. The clockwise habit is so deep in me that I could not have told you, if you had asked me the day before, that I even had it. It was below the level of habit. It was closer to anatomy, the way you do not decide which foot to start walking on. To reverse it would feel like putting my shirt on inside out, like buttoning from the bottom, like signing my name with my left hand. A wrongness not of morality, but of grain, of the direction the wood of me was cut. And here was a man in my handwriting recording the one single deviation from routine that I would consider the most unthinkable, the most impossible for me specifically, the one I would have named if you had asked me to name a thing I would simply never do. And recording in 4 flat words that it had felt wrong the whole day. Felt wrong the whole day. Not frightening, not dangerous, wrong. The precise word I would have used. The word of a man for whom the direction of a morning walk is a load-bearing wall. And I sat there in the thin gray light that was warming, now toward noon, with a topographic map on the wall and the percolator ticking as it cooled. And for the first time since I had come up the mountain, I felt the specific cold that I would come to know very well before the snow fell. The cold that is not in the air but in the space just behind the sternum. A cold with a location. A cold you could point to on your own body. And I understood, without yet being able to say it in words, that I had found something that was not a letter from a friend. I understood it the way you understand in the first instant of a fall, before pain, before fear, in a region below both, that the ground is no longer where you left it. I closed the pad then. I did close it finally, with a small, deliberate motion, the cover coming down over the swollen pages with a soft, papery weight, and I set my hand flat on it for a moment, the way you would set your hand on a Bible or on the chest of a sleeping animal, and I told myself I was done with it. But you already know it was too late, because a thing you have read cannot be unread, and a question that has entered you cannot be made to leave. And the question that had entered me was very simple, and I could not put it down, and it would not let me sleep. The question was, who was he? And underneath that question, not yet in words, not yet daring to be in words, coiled down in the dark where the cold was the second question, the real one. The one the ridge had been patiently waiting for me to ask since the day I drove up the fire road with my percolator and my crossed sevens and my private little watch of a life. The second question was, how does a man I have never met write in my hand? And beneath even that, I did not reach it that first day. It took weeks. It took the whole slow ruin to bring me down to it. But I will tell you now so you can watch it coming. Beneath even that was the third question, the one that was not really a question at all, but a recognition dressed as one. And it was this: what if he is not another man? What if there was never another man? What if the pad is not a record of someone who came before me, but a record of me? And the only mystery is which one of us is doing the writing. But that was weeks away. On the 9th of May, I only knew that I had a question I could not put down. and that I would not sleep, and I did not sleep. And in the morning I got up and I walked the catwalk clockwise, and I want to tell you about that walk and about Hollis and about the pause on the radio, because that is where the ordinary daylight investigation began, the part I could still, for a little while longer, tell myself I was in charge of. I walked the catwalk clockwise the next morning the way I always had, and I want to tell you that this was defiance, that I strode out into that shell-colored fog and made my circuit sunwise as a way of refusing the pad, of planting my boots on the boards and saying to it, "You are not me, and I will prove it with my feet, one plank at a time all the way around." But it was not defiance. I knew, even while I was doing it, that it was not defiance, and the knowing was the worst part. It was fear dressed as habit. I did the thing I always did because the thing I always did was the last wall standing between me and the cold behind my sternum. And I understood, walking, that the very moment I broke a routine, because the pad had described breaking it, the moment I walked counterclockwise to spite the pad, or clockwise to spite it, it did not even matter which the pad would own me, because both of those were reactions to the pad. And a man reacting to a thing is a man being steered by it. The only way to be free of the pad was to walk the way I would have walked if I had never found it. And I could not do that anymore, because I had found it, and there is no unfinding. Every step of that circuit I was performing my own innocence for an audience of one, myself, and failing to convince him, because he had read the pages and he knew. So I walked clockwise, and it did not feel like mine. That is the thing I carried down off the catwalk that morning, colder than I had gone up, my own oldest habit, the grain of me, and it felt borrowed. It felt like a costume of myself, and I understood that the pad had not needed to make me walk counterclockwise to poison the walk. It had only needed to make me think about the direction I walked, and the direction had been ruined by the thinking. The way a word repeated too many times comes loose from its meaning and becomes just a mouth noise, strange and dead. Clockwise, clockwise. I said it to myself, and it stopped being a direction and became two hard sounds, and I stood at the firefinder with my hands on the cold sighting ring, and I thought, this is how it will go then. Not by making me do strange things, by making the ordinary things strange, by turning the light on in every automatic room of me so that nothing could run in the dark anymore. And a man cannot live with all the lights on. A man needs most of himself to run in the dark. That is what habit is for. That is what it is. I logged the temperature and the wind. I radioed 0600 status green to the district office, and Hollis's voice came back, dry and unhurried, the only other human sound in the world. And he said, "Copy green. Quiet up there?" And I said, "Quiet." And there was a pause on the line that I did not like. I have to tell you about the pauses because the radio was the one thread out of that place. And I spent my life on the ridge learning to read it the way a blind man reads a face. By touch, by the smallest changes. There is the pause that is just the ridge eating a signal. I came to know it very well. A furring at the edges of a voice. A swelling of static that rushes in from underneath and lifts the words off their feet and carries them away half-finished. And it has a texture, that pause, a busy hissing fullness, the sound of a channel doing something. And then there is the other pause, the empty one, the one that is not the ridge but a man on the other end holding still, holding a breath, deciding something. The empty pause has no texture. It is a held silence with a person inside it. And what came back after I said quiet that morning was the second kind. It was Hollis, 60 miles away at his desk that I had built for him out of nothing, with his crossword and his taped-up grandchildren holding still. And then he said, "Good." Just that. Just good. In a voice that had gone a half step down from where his voice usually sat. And he clicked off. And I stood there holding the handset with the empty air of him gone out of it. And I thought about that good all day. I am the kind of man who thinks about a good all day. I have told you that, and now you have seen it. By evening, I had built a small structure of reasoning around it, the way I build a structure around everything, a scaffold around the whole of it. And the structure said, Hollis knows something about this station. That pause was not idle. He held still because I had said quiet, and quiet meant something to him that it did not yet mean to me, and good was relief. The relief of a man hearing that the thing he was braced for has not yet arrived. He has talked to men who worked his post before me. He has data, and a man with data is a man you can question. And questioning was a thing I knew how to do. It was orderly, it was a system, and I clung to it. So at 1800, after I gave my evening status and he gave his copy, I kept the transmit key held down, which you are not supposed to do. You're supposed to clear the channel, and I said as evenly as I could make my voice, as though it were the most ordinary administrative question in the world. Hollis, who had this post before me? The silence that came back was the second kind, the empty kind. I knew it instantly, and my stomach knew it before I did. It went on longer than a dropped signal would have, because a dropped signal comes back or it does not. It resolves one way or the other in a second or two, and this just hung there, textureless, a held breath 60 miles long. Then he said, "You'd have to ask the district office for personnel records," which was not an answer, which was the careful, rehearsed, sidestepping non-answer of a man who has been told, at some point, by someone what he is not to say, and who is reaching for the form of the words he was given. And something in me, the noticing thing, the thing that cannot leave a sprung nail pressed. I said, "I'm asking you, Hollis, not the records, you." And there was another pause, shorter, and this one had something moving in it. A small sound, maybe a breath let out through the nose, maybe a chair. And then his voice came back, and it had changed. It had stepped down out of the professional register, out of copy and green and status, into something older and lower and more tired. The voice a man uses late at night to another man he will never meet. The voice of the confessional. And he said, "I've been on this desk 9 years." I waited. I had learned by then that you do not fill an empty pause. You let the other man fill it, and he filled it. "There's always been somebody up there," he said. "That's all I'll tell you. There's always been somebody, and they always ask me that question." A pause. "And they always ask it about 3 weeks in." I did not say anything. I could not have. The cold behind my sternum had spread up into my throat. "I don't know what it is," he said, quieter still, almost to himself now, as though he had forgotten the key was open, as though he were saying a thing he had said before, in this same low voice, to other men on other evenings, a thing worn smooth by repetition, the way the initials in the percolator were worn smooth. "I've never been up there, and I never will, but I've sat this desk 9 years, and every season there's a somebody, and every somebody's the same, and around 3 weeks in the voice changes, and then a little while after that comes the question, who had the post before me, and I've stopped." He stopped. "I've stopped answering it straight. It doesn't help. It's never once helped." And then he clicked off, and he did not answer when I keyed him again, and I keyed him 3 times, 4, saying his name into the dark, "Hollis, Hollis, come back." And there was nothing, not even the busy full static of a signal being eaten, just the flat patient hiss of an open channel with no one on the other end. And I do not know if he had walked away from the desk or was sitting there with his hand over his mouth, or had simply decided, as he must have decided many times before, that the kindest thing was silence. I sat in the dark with the radio hissing its nothing, and I did not turn on the lamp for a long time. And outside the last light went out of the valley the way it always did, from the bottom up, the shadow of the ridge lengthening across the 4 counties like a hand closing. They always ask it about 3 weeks in. I want to be precise about what that sentence did to me, because it did not frighten me the way the pad had frightened me. It wounded me somewhere the pad had not reached. The pad had been a private thing, a cold thing, a thing I could hold in my 2 hands and turn over and, if I chose, put back under the floor and pretend I had never lifted the board. It was mine, my anomaly, my mystery, and there is a kind of grandeur in a private mystery, a sense that you have been singled out, chosen, that the universe has bent down to whisper to you and you alone. Hollis's sentence took that away. Hollis's sentence meant the pattern was not mine. It meant I was standing in a groove, and the groove was old, and the groove was deep, and it had been worn there by men, by a long procession of men, each of whom had climbed this fire road as a whole and singular person, each of whom had stood on that catwalk in the shell-colored fog and thought, I have gotten far enough away to be safe, and each of whom had, at a predictable interval, at 3 weeks in, right on the schedule, begun to change and begun to ask, and a tired man at a desk 60 miles away had watched it happen over and over and had learned that nothing he said could stop it. I was not the protagonist of anything. I was an installment, a rerun. The next in a line so long its earliest members were worn smooth as the initials under the coffee, and the thing that had reached down to whisper to me had whispered the exact same words to every man before me, and would whisper them to every man after. And my name was not even required for the whispering. Any man would do, so long as he was a man who noticed, so long as he could not leave the board sprung. And a man like me, a man who had spent his whole life trying to be the sole and careful author of his own small-ordered world, who had built systems precisely so that nothing could happen to him that he had not written down first, and therefore, in some sense, chosen. A man like me cannot easily survive the discovery that he is a page in a book he did not write, in a hand that is nonetheless, unmistakably, his own. That is the wound Hollis gave me, and he gave it, I understand now, out of a kind of exhausted mercy, because the alternative was to answer the question straight, and answering it straight had never once helped, and this, the sidestep, the low, tired confession, had at least the virtue that it might, this once with this man, break the pattern by naming it. It did not. Of course it did not. I want you to hold on to that, because it becomes the whole terrible engine of the thing later. That even Hollis's attempt to warn me became in the end just another line in the groove, another entry the pad already contained, a warning worn as smooth by repetition as everything else on that mountain. I got the pad out again that night. Of course I did. There was never any real question that I would. I had made a decision to be done with it and set my hand on the cover like a benediction. And the decision had lasted exactly 1 day and 1 radio call. And now Hollis's voice was in me saying, there's always been somebody, and I had to know how far back the somebody went. And the only record I had was the pad. And so I cut through my own resolve the way I would later cut through electrical tape. And I opened it, and I read faster now, and worse, I read forward. And I am going to have to describe to you what forward means, because it is the center of everything, and I have been circling it since I began. The way you circle a thing in cold water before you make yourself go in. When I first found the pad, the morning before, its dates had run from the middle of April to the first week of May behind me. In the past, a completed record of a season already lived by someone, sealed and finished and shut under a floor. That was a haunting I could have lived with. A dead man's diary is a sad thing, but it is a knowable thing. It points backward into ground already walked, and the dead do not add to their pages. But the 9th of May had been the day I found it, and now, that night, it was the 10th, and I turned. I remember the exact feeling in my fingers, the way the swollen pages resisted and then gave, that dry, small, tearing whisper of damp paper coming unstuck from itself. I turned to the entry for the 10th of May in his dating, and it was there. It had not been there. I need to defend that claim, because it is the one on which everything rests, and it is the one no one can be made to believe. Least of all a man like me, who knows exactly how little the testimony of a solitary person is worth. I know what isolation does. I know that the mind, left alone long enough, becomes an unreliable narrator of its own contents, that it will edit the past to suit the present without ever telling you it has done so, that a man on a mountain who wants a page to have been blank yesterday will remember it blank whether it was or not. I know all of that. I knew it then. And so on the first morning, when I had read the pad and found it a record of the past, I had done the thing my whole nature demanded. I had counted the written pages. same reflex as the stairs and the ceiling tiles, my hand riffling the corner and my mind ticking off the count. And the count had stopped at the entry for the first week of May, and after it the pages were blank, and I knew the number. I will not tell you the number, because a number would sound like a lie, trying too hard to be believed, but I knew it. It was in me the way my own weight is in me. And when I opened the pad on the night of the 10th and found writing on a page that my count had told me was blank, I felt the number change under my hand like a bone shifting, and there is no version of me, no matter how alone, no matter how far gone, that miscounts. Counting is the one thing I have never once in my life gotten wrong. It is the floor beneath all my other floors, and the count had changed. A written page existed that had not existed. That is the fact. I have laid down my whole reason for you to weigh it, and I have weighed it every night since, and it does not get lighter. The entry for the 10th of May read, "Asked Hollis who had the post before. He said, there's always been somebody." I didn't sleep. I read the pad again. You see what it had become. You see the shape of it. The shape I keep telling you is the whole point. The pad was no longer a record of a man before me. Or no, I have to be exact, because the exactness is the horror, and the horror is in the exactness. It was still a record of a man before me. The ink was still old, the paper still swollen. Everything about it still spoke of years in the dark under the floor, and yet the thing it recorded was me, was my day, my sleepless night, my second reading, my conversation with Hollis word for word, the words still warm in my mouth. A record of me, aged years, waiting for me under a floor, running one day ahead. So that every morning from then on I would wake into a life that had already been written the night before, in old ink in my hand, by a man who was gone. And every night I would read the writing and find that I had done, that day, exactly what the previous night's page said I would do. And I would not be able to tell, ever again, whether I was living my life or reciting it. That is the trap, and I want you to feel the jaws of it, because it is more perfect than any cage of bars. It is not that the future was terrible. If the pad had shown me terrible things, my own death, some monster on the fire road, a fire I would fail to see, I could have braced against them, prepared, resisted, and in the resisting, I would have stayed a man with a will, a man the future was being done to. The terror was that the future was ordinary, and that it was mine. The pad never once showed me a thing I would not have done. It showed me asking Hollis the question I had already been aching to ask. It showed me not sleeping when I could feel the sleeplessness already in my body. It showed me reading the pad again, which I was, at that very moment, doing. Every entry was a thing I recognized as authentically, undeniably my own, desired by me, chosen by me, the free act of my free will, and every entry had been written down before I did it, and I could not point to a single line and say I would never, the way I had said it, that first day, about the counterclockwise walk, because I had said I would never walk counterclockwise, and then I had walked clockwise the next morning to prove I was not him, and I turned the pages and I found that too, further on, in the old blue ink. Walked clockwise to prove I'm not him, that's in here too. Even my defiance was a page. Even my reading of my defiance's defiance was a page. The pad had a line for the man who finds a line and rebels against it, and a line for the man who finds that line. And there was no floor to it, no bottom, no place to stand outside the record and be free, because the standing outside was itself written down, waiting, in my own patient hand. I stopped reading ahead after that. I want that on the record, that I fought, that I did not simply surrender to it that second night that took much longer, and it came differently than you would think. It came as rest and not defeat, but I will get there. On the night of the 10th I fought, and I fought the only way I have ever known how to fight anything, which is with a system. I made a rule, and you will understand by now what a rule was to me. It was not a preference. It was not a resolution of the kind people make and break. It was the closest thing I had to a prayer, a load-bearing wall, an act of the will made concrete and external so that it could hold weight my will alone could rule was this: I will not read past today. I will let the pad be a record and not a prophecy. Each day I will read only the entry for that day. To confirm, I told myself it was to confirm, to study, as though I were a scientist and not a man drowning, and I will not turn one page past it. Because, I reasoned, and the reasoning had the beautiful airtight logic of all my reasoning, the logic that has never once saved me. If I do not read tomorrow's page, then tomorrow cannot be written yet. And if tomorrow is not yet written, I am still the author of it. I am still a man with a future he chooses rather than recites. The rule made me the author again. That was its whole purpose. It rebuilt in one stroke the wall between me and the groove. I wrote the rule on an index card because a rule in the head is a wish and a rule on a card is a fact. I taped the index card to the front cover of the pad. Then, and I did this slowly, deliberately, with a kind of ceremony. And I remember feeling as I did it, the old, clean satisfaction I have always felt in building a system. The satisfaction that is very close to safety and has never once actually been safety. I took the roll of black electrical tape from the workbench downstairs and I taped the pad shut. A cross of tape over the cover, one band around the long way and one around the short, sealing the covers together so that to read it I would have to make a decision, would have to physically cut, would have to break a thing I had built. And I am the kind of man for whom breaking a thing I have built is nearly impossible. It is a violence against the self. And I put the taped and carded pad into the bottom drawer of the desk under the west window, and I closed the drawer, and I stood there in the dark feeling the satisfaction, and I did not see this is the part I cannot forgive in myself. Not because it was a failure of intelligence, but because it was so exactly, so predictably me. I did not see that the system was itself a page. That a careful man taping shut the thing he is afraid of, and writing a rule on a card and sealing it in a drawer and feeling safe is precisely the entry the Ridge would most want to write. Because it is the entry that proves the man is still doing the only thing he knows how to do, still reaching for the scaffold, still building walls around the hole instead of looking down into it. Still, and this is what the pad was for, I understand now. This is the whole of its work, still choosing the record over the living thing. I held the rule for 11 days. I have told you that already near the beginning. And I tell you again because I am proud of it, and because 11 days is a long time, and because I want you to have the shape of it. 11 days of a man not reading past today. 11 days of opening a taped drawer only in his imagination, of doing his circuits and his status calls, and eating his meals at the hours his meals were due. And if the routines had begun somewhere around the 6th or 7th day, to feel less like a fortress I lived inside and more like the pacing of an animal that has learned the exact dimensions of its cage, learned them so well it no longer needs the bars, walks the same worn oval whether the door is open or shut. I did not let myself think that, because to think it was to write it. And I was trying so hard in those 11 days not to write. And it was in those 11 days, forbidden the pad, that I turned instead to the station itself and began the other investigation, the archaeological one, the one that did not require me to break my rule because the station was not the pad. The station was just a building, and a building is only evidence, and there is no rule against reading evidence. I told myself it was maintenance. I told myself I was learning the post, familiarizing myself with the history of my station the way any conscientious man would, and there was a shred of truth in that. The shred there always was, the shred that let me keep going. But it was not maintenance. It was a search. I was looking for the somebodies. Hollis had said there's always been somebody, and the pad had said that's in here too. And I had a taped drawer and 11 days and a mountain of empty hours. And I went through that station room by room and surface by surface, looking for the men who had come before me. And I found them. And I want to tell you what I found, because it is where the thing stopped being possibly my imagination and became past any rule, past any doubt, past the count of pages, undeniably real. Once you know to look, a lookout station is a palimpsest. I have used that word to myself so many times up there, and since, that it has worn smooth like everything else. but it is the right word, and I will keep it. A palimpsest is a page that has been written on and scraped clean and written on again and again, so that under the fresh ink, if you hold it to the right light, the old ink shows through. Ghost letters, the sentences of the dead surfacing under the sentences of the living. That is what the station was. Every surface in it had been written over by hands that were gone, and for 3 weeks I had lived among their writing without reading it, the way you live for years in a house without ever really seeing the wallpaper. And now I saw it everywhere, and I could not stop seeing it, and each thing I found was both perfectly innocent and perfectly damning. The doubleness again, always the doubleness. The initials in the percolator base, I have told you about those, and I went back to them now with new eyes, and I counted them. Of course I counted them, and I tried to read them, and the deep ones I could read, sharp block letters cut with the point of a knife by men who wanted, I think, exactly what I had wanted when I first saw them, to belong to a long, quiet order, to leave a mark that said I was here. I kept this watch. But the smooth ones I could not read, and the smoothest set of all, the one worn to a memory of a carving, I put my thumb over and I felt the grooves that were almost not grooves anymore. And I did the arithmetic I had refused to do in my first innocent week. A set of initials cut into steel does not wear away in a season. It does not wear away in 10 seasons. To wear initials that smooth takes a thumb, one thumb, running over them morning after morning while the coffee perks, thousands of mornings. And there had not been thousands of rangers. The post was not that old, which meant it was not many thumbs, but few thumbs, few men each staying a very long time. Or, and this is the thought that came up out of the cold and would not go back down, one thumb, running and running, one man's habit repeated across a span that no single man's life could hold. I put the percolator down that day, and I did not run my thumb over the smooth initials again. I did not want to add to them. I did not want to find out whose they were becoming. The garage was next. I went out to the garage bay on the 9th day of the rule, ostensibly to check the fuel drums, and I found on the inside of the roll-down door, low, in the corner where a man would crouch, a tally. Gate count marks, the 4 strokes and a slash that a man uses to count a thing he is enduring rather than a thing he is enjoying. And there were hundreds of them, ranks and ranks of gates marching across the corrugated steel, and I crouched there in the smell of diesel and cold metal, and I began, God help me, to count them. And I got a long way into the counting before I understood 2 things. The first was that the marks were not all in the same hand, or the same tool. Some were scratched deep with a blade, some scored lighter with a nail. Some were nearly rust now, and some looked almost fresh, which meant they were not one man's count of one season, but many men's counts, laid over each other, a communal tally of endured time, gate upon gate upon gate. And the second thing, the thing that made me stop counting and stand up too fast and crack my head on the door track, was that they did not add up to seasons. I did not finish the count. I could not. My hands would not. The number was getting away from me the way a number gets away from you in a nightmare, where you count and the total keeps growing behind you. But I had gone far enough to know that there were too many days. More days of endured time scratched into that door than the post could have existed. More than could be accounted for by the seasons a fire lookout has been standing on Sifton Ridge, unless the days scratched there were not all days the world had counted, unless some of them were days that had happened only up here, only to the somebody over and over, the same 3 weeks in stretch, scratched fresh each time by a man who did not know the man before him had already scratched it. I want to be careful, because here I am reasoning past what I saw, and I promised you I would tell you the difference. What I saw was many hands, too many gates, my own head cracked on a door track. What I concluded is a thing I concluded later, in the long revision that has been the rest of my life, and you are free to set it aside. But I will tell you the feeling I had crouched in that garage, because the feeling was data too. The feeling was the truest instrument I had, and the feeling was recognition. The tally felt like mine. Not that I had made it, I had made none of it. I had been on the ridge 3 weeks and had scratched nothing anywhere, but that I would have made it, that it was the exact mark I would leave, the exact way I would count endured time, and that somewhere in those hundreds of gates was the shape of my own hand waiting to be filled, a place in the ranks that was mine, that had my name on it in the way that a thing can have your name on it without any letters at all. And then, on the 11th day, the last day of the rule, though I did not know it was the last day, I found the paperback. It was behind the water tank in the downstairs room, the cold room, wedged into the gap between the tank and the wall where a thing could fall and be forgotten. And I only found it because I had gone down to check the tank's fittings and dropped my flashlight, and it rolled into the gap, and I reached after it, and my fingers closed on paper instead of steel. A paperback novel swollen with the same damp as the pad, the same swelling, the same sweetish organic smell. The cover long gone or torn away so that I never learned what the story was, just a brick of foxed and wavy pages. And I almost put it back, it was only a book. A ranger's left behind reading, the most innocent thing in the world. A man kills the long hours up here somehow, and some men read. But I am the man who cannot leave the sprung nail, and I opened it, and the margins were full of writing, and the writing was not mine. I have to make you feel what that was, because it was the first thing on the whole ridge that gave me hope, real hope. A clean, bright spike of it that went through me so hard I laughed out loud in the cold room. One bark of a laugh that came back off the concrete walls, because here, at last, was another hand. A small, cramped, hurried hand, nothing like my block capitals, a left-leaning scrawl with the G's closed and the 7's uncrossed. A hand that was somebody else's. Proof. Physical proof I could hold in my two shaking hands that not every man who came to this ridge became me, that the pad's terrible sameness was not the only truth of the place, that there had been at least one other, a real other, a genuinely different person who had sat in this station and read this book and left his own strange mark that was not my mark. Do you see what I wanted? I wanted company. Under everything, under the fear and the counting and the rule, what I wanted, what the whole search had really been for, was to not be the only one, to not be alone in the groove. And here was a hand that was not mine, and I held it to my chest in the cold, and I felt, for one moment, saved. And then I read what the cramped hand had written, and the hope went out of me the way the light goes out of the valley, from the bottom up. Because the annotations were not notes on the novel. They did not remark on the story or argue with the characters or mark a fine sentence the way a reader's marginalia does. They were dates. Down the margins, page after page, in that hurried left-leaning scrawl, a man had used the white edges of somebody else's book as a log. Because I understood this instantly, it needed no explaining, because he had not wanted to write in the pad. He had found the pad, as I had found it, and he had been afraid of it, as I was afraid of it, and he had refused it the way I was refusing it in my taped drawer. And he had needed somewhere else to write, some surface the ridge had not already claimed, and he had chosen the margins of a novel, and he had tracked there in secret, alongside a stranger's fiction, the days of his own unraveling, the days on which he had found the green steno pad under the floorboard, the day its entries began to run one ahead of him, the day he made his rule. I read his rule in his hand, and it was not my rule, his was different. He had resolved to burn the pad, not tape it, and I felt the hope flare again. He did something different. He chose differently. Maybe he got out, and I turned the swollen pages to the end, to the last annotation, on the last written page of the book, and the cramped hand there was worse, shakier, pressed so hard in places it had torn the soft paper, and it said, "He walks clockwise. He thinks that saves him. Tell the next one it doesn't." I want to describe the light in the room when I read that, because the light is the thing I remember most clearly, more clearly than the fear, which had by then become so constant that it was less an emotion than a climate I lived in. Whether I had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing that it is cold once you have been cold long enough. It was evening. It was always evening when the ridge did its real work, I came to learn that the mornings were the fog's and the days were the job's, but the evenings were the ridge's own. The low red hour, and the sun was going down behind the western shoulder and coming through the small dirty window of the cold room, low and red. Red, the color of the inside of an eyelid when you shut your eyes against a bright light, and it lay across the concrete, and across the swollen brick of the book, and across that cramped, tearing warning. Tell the next one it doesn't. And I understood two things at once, and they arrived together, and they have never come apart since. The first was that the man who wrote that annotation had been exactly where I was standing, not near it, in it, on his own 11th day or his own 12th, refusing his own pad, hoarding his own secret log in the margins of the only unclaimed paper he could find. And he had thought of me, not me by name, he could not have known my name, but of the next one, the next somebody, the next installment, the man who would come after him and find the pad and be afraid and walk clockwise and think it saved him. And in the middle of his own terror, he had turned outward. He had spent some of his last shaking strength trying to reach forward across the years to warn a stranger. And the stranger was me, and I was reading it, and I was moved almost past bearing by the kindness of it. This dead, frightened man reaching for my sleeve. And the second thing I understood, arriving in the same red instant, was that he had failed. That his warning had reached me only as one more confirmation of the pattern. He walks clockwise. He thinks that saves him. I had walked clockwise. I had thought it saved me. The warning did not free me from the groove. It proved the groove. It described me with a precision no stranger should have had. It told me that my one small defiant act, the clockwise walk I had performed to prove I was not him, had been performed identically by the man before me and noticed by him, and named, and left behind as a warning that could only ever arrive too late. Because by the time you can read, he walks clockwise, you have already walked clockwise. The walking is what qualifies you to find the book. Even his attempt to break the cycle had become part of the cycle's record. Even his kindness was in the groove. He had reached forward to save the next one, and the reaching had only carved the next gate. And I understood, kneeling there in the red light with the shaking book in my hands, that whatever I did now, whether I obeyed the pad or defied it, taped it shut or burned it like him, kept my rule or broke it, warned the next man or said nothing at all, had almost certainly already been done, by him or by the man before him, or by the man whose initials were worn smoothest of all in the base of the percolator, and that there was no act available to me, not one, that was not already a page. That is the day the rule died, though it took the frost to kill it, and the frost came that night. And I have to tell you now, the thing I have been walking around since I began, the keystone, the thing about my wife, because without it, none of the rest of it means what it means. The pad did not find a stranger to break. It found a man who was already in the deepest and most unforgivable room of himself, exactly the man the pad was written for. I have to tell you why the handwriting was mine. It was mine because it could not have been anyone else's. There was no other hand it could have been. I broke the rule on the night of the first frost. I've already told you I held it 11 days, and I want the 11 days to stand, because they were real and they cost me. But a wall that holds 11 days and falls on the 12th is a fallen wall, and the falling is what matters. And I want to tell you honestly how it fell, because it did not fall the way you would think. It was not battered down. It was not that the pad grew louder in its drawer or the temptation grew until I could not stand it. It fell the way everything on that ridge fell, quietly, from the top down, because of a cold radiator and a soft board, and the oldest habit I had, the one I have never in my life been able to break, which is that I cannot leave a sprung nail sprung. The frost came in the night, the first real frost, and I woke to it before dawn. Woke to the particular quality of cold that means the season has turned, and I went down my morning routine and found the downstairs radiator dead for good. Not temperamental now, but dead. The cast iron cold as a stone in a creek. And I knew it was beyond me, and I knew I would heat the upstairs with kerosene the rest of the season. And I knew, too, with the part of me that was still keeping records, that this was the entry the old blue ink had waited under. Radiator downstairs temperamental. The first line I had read, the radiator that a man 3 or 4 tenants back had patched the leak above in a hurry, and I had wondered what made him hurry, and now I thought I knew. I thought he had hurried because he had wanted to close the floor back up. I thought the leak was never the point. I thought he had been down there for the same reason I kept finding myself down there, drawn back to the soft corner, to the board, the way the tongue is drawn to the broken tooth over and over, unable to leave it. Because I was down there again. That is the thing. I had gone down ostensibly to confirm the radiator was dead, but I was on my knees in the soft corner in the pre-dawn cold, with my breath showing in the flashlight beam, and my hand was on the board, and I understood, kneeling there, that I had not come down to check the radiator at all, that I had invented the radiator as a reason the way I had invented maintenance as a reason for the search, that the true thing, the thing under the reason, was that I needed to be near the place where the pad had lain, and I understood that this need was, itself, almost certainly a page, that somewhere in the taped drawer upstairs there was a line in old blue ink that said, "Went down to the floorboard on the night of the frost," and that I would give anything, anything, to know whether it was there, to know whether even this, even my helpless returning, had been written before me, and that need not to read the future, but to find out whether my present was already the past that was the need that killed the rule. It was not desire for the pad. It was the unbearable itch of the sprung nail, the thing I have never been able to leave. The noticing thing, the thing the ridge had been fishing for from the start. I went back up. I opened the drawer, and I cut the tape. The pad opened to the day's date on its own, the way a book falls open to the page you have read most, except I had never read this page. My rule had kept me from it, and it was full, both leaves covered in my hand, and I read it kneeling on the floor with my coat still on, and the cold coming up through the boards into my knees, and it did not say what I had braced for. I had braced for prophecy, for he will do this, and then he will do that, for the day-ahead schedule that had first shown me the trap. And instead, the entry for the night of the first frost was not about the frost, and not about the radiator, and not about the board or the tape or the rule. It was about her. It was about the morning I refilled the prescription. I have to tell you the thing now, the whole of it, because the pad told it, and I cannot tell you what the pad did to me without telling you what the pad said. And what the pad said was the truth, the actual truth. The one I had carried up the fire road folded so small and pushed so deep that I had almost, on my best mornings on the catwalk, believed I had left it behind. My wife was sick. I told you that at the beginning, and I have made you wait for the rest, and here is the rest. She was sick in her mind before she was sick in her body, a long, slow illness of the mind that I did not have a name for at first, and then had too many names for her. None of them the right size for what was happening to her. And I did for her what I do for everything, the only thing I know how to do. The thing that is my love and my defect, and they are the same thing. And that is the whole tragedy of me. I made systems. I made a notebook. I charted her medications and the times of them, her moods on a scale I devised, her weight, her sleep, her appetite, the good days and the bad, and the reasons, if I could find reasons, always looking for the reasons, because a reason is a thing you can act on, and I needed to act. I could not bear to only witness. I have never been able to only witness. In blue ink, block capitals, the dates underlined twice. I kept her the way I kept the weather, and I told myself I truly believed that if I kept the record carefully enough, I could keep her, that a life sufficiently well documented could not be lost, that the notebook was a kind of net woven fine enough that she could not fall through it, and I sat up nights making the net finer, and she was lost anyway. She was lost on a morning when I had gone to refill a prescription. The pills were due. The system said the pills were due. The notebook had a line for when the pills were due, and the line said that morning, and I went to refill them, and I left her alone for 40 minutes, because the system said the pills were due, and the system did not have a line for her. She should not be left alone right now. The system had lines for medications and moods and weight and sleep. and it did not have a line for the thing that mattered most that morning, which was simply and only that she should not have been alone. And I did not see it, because I was reading the net and not her face, and I came home to a house that was very quiet. And here is the thing the pad said that no living person knew. Here is the thing I had never told anyone, had never let myself fully think in words, had folded so small. When I came home to the quiet house, in the first minute, the first and worst minute, before I called anyone, before I called for help, before I let myself feel a single thing, I went to the notebook. I went to my notebook and I made an entry. I wrote the time. I wrote what I had found, in block capitals with the date underlined twice, because the system did not have a line for grief, but it had a line for events, and I made this an event. I made that an event, because making it an event was the only way I knew how to keep standing in that room, the only scaffold I had that would bear that weight. And so I reached for it. I reached for the record instead of for her, in the last moment when reaching for her might still have, not still have. It was already too late by then. I have made myself believe it was already too late, the doctor said later, that it was likely already too late. But I did not know that in the first minute. In the first minute, I did not go to her to find out. I went to the notebook. I documented her. I documented her the way I documented the weather, and I have hated myself for it every single day since. And I have never told anyone, not the doctors, not her family, not the one grief counselor I saw twice and could not go back to, no one, because it is the most shameful thing I know about myself, and it is also the truest. And I folded it small and I carried it up a mountain to get away from it. And it was there, on the ridge, under the floor, in old blue ink in my own hand, waiting. The pad described that morning in a detail I had never spoken aloud. The color of the light in the kitchen, the number of pills, the 40 minutes, the quiet of the house. And then it described what I did, the reaching for the notebook, the entry, the block capitals, the doubly underlined date, all of it. And at the bottom of the page, below the description, in the same hand, was one line that was not a memory and not a prophecy, but something else, something worse than either. A line that spoke for the first and only time, directly across the gap, out of the pad, to me in the present tense, as though the writer had set down the record and looked up. You've always done this. The ridge didn't make you a man who watches instead of lives. It just gave you a clean place to do it. I understand that a rational account requires me here to explain how the pad could contain a thing that only I knew. A thing I had told no one, a thing I had barely told myself. And I do not have that explanation. I have never had it. I want to be honest about that with you, the way I have tried to be honest about everything, that I reached the center of the thing and there was no mechanism there to find, no hidden reader, no trick of the isolated mind that I can point to and say there, that is how, because I had told no one, there was no one on that mountain. And a man cannot leak a secret to himself in his own hand and be surprised by it years before he arrives. I do not know how. And I have come to believe this is the hardest one thing I brought down off the ridge, and it is the thing I most want to hand you, that the question, how is the wrong thing to want? That wanting, how is itself a system? It is the mind's last routine, the final wall, the last scaffold thrown up around the last hole. The man who wrote in the margins of the paperback wanted how. The man whose initials are worn smoothest of all wanted how. And the ridge is patient with that wall, endlessly patient, because it knows the wall is built of the same stone as the man. That a man asking how is a man keeping his attention on the mechanism and off the meaning, letting himself be a man investigating an anomaly instead of a man kneeling on a cold floor reading the truest sentence anyone has ever written about him in his own hand and having to answer it. And on the night of the first frost, I stopped asking how. Not because I solved it, because I finally saw what the asking was for. And once I stopped asking how, there was nothing left between me and the meaning. And the meaning came in, the way the cold came up through the boards from below and filled me. After that, the rule was gone, and I did not tape the pad shut again, and I read all of it. I read it the way you would read a letter you already know contains your death sentence, which is to say slowly and completely, and with a terrible calm. Because once the worst thing has been said, the rest cannot hurt you the way the anticipation did. And the worst thing had been said. It was on the Frost Night page, and everything else was only detail. I read forward and I read back, and I want to tell you what I found when I read back. Because reading forward had shown me the trap, but reading back showed me the truth. And they are not the same. The trap is a mechanism and the truth is a shape. When I read back, looking for the beginning, I could not find one. I turned to the earliest pages I could reach, expecting to find the first day, the middle of April, a man arriving fresh at his post, and the earliest entries were already the writing of a man who had found a pad. Do you understand? The oldest ink in the oldest pages was already the record of somebody who had lifted a floorboard and found, under it, a green steno pad in his own hand, and been afraid of it, and made a rule about it. There was no first day. There was no innocent arrival. No clean 3 weeks at the bottom of it. No man who came to the ridge before the pad existed. As far back as I could read, the pad was already there, already found, already being written about in the pad. And I understood that it was records, each ranger reading the account of the ranger before him and recording that he had read it. So that the pad was not a document at all, not really, not a thing with an author and a subject and a beginning. It was a groove worn by the passage of identical men, each one certain he was the first, each one lifting the board with that same clean pleasure I had felt. Here is a letter from a friend, each one reading his own hand and being unable to explain it, each one making his rule and breaking it on the frost. Each one reaching the Frost Night page and reading the truest sentence about himself, and each one taking up the pen at the end. I'm getting ahead, but you can see it coming now. You've seen it coming for a while and writing the next installment for the next man. In the only hand the pad has ever had, which is mine, which is his, which is the hand of every man. The ridge has ever fished up out of his own solitude, because we were all, the same man. In the only way that finally matters, which is not the name and not the face, but the flaw, the one flaw, the flaw of the man who reaches for the record instead of the living thing. And I stopped being able to tell, reading back, whether I was reading about myself or about a man 40 years dead, whether the Frost Night confession about the notebook was my confession or his, whether the wife in it was my wife or a wife who had died in another decade in a house I never stood in. And the more I read, the less the distinction held, and I felt it dissolving under me. The distinction, the one I had defended from the very first morning, he is not me, I am not him. I am the sole and careful author of my own small ordered world. I felt it going soft like the board in the corner, and I understood at last that this dissolving was the whole of what the ridge was for. It had never wanted to frighten me. I had thought the whole time that fear was the point, that the pad was a haunting, and I was its victim, and the emotion between us was terror, and it was not. Fear was just friction. Fear was the sound of the wall I made as it was worn away, the way a brake makes a sound as it stops a wheel, and the sound is not the point of the brake. What the ridge wanted was not my fear. What it wanted was for the friction to end, for the wall to come down, for me to stop resisting the one true thing, which was that the man I had spent my life insisting I uniquely was the careful author, the keeper of the net, the man whose double underlined date was the private signature of his singular soul, was not singular at all, had never been singular, was the common tongue of every watching man who ever climbed a mountain to get far enough from the living to feel safe among his records. I was not the author of the pad. I was its latest handwriting. And the wall between those two things, which had held me up my whole life, which was the whole architecture of me, came down on the ridge, quietly, from the top, the way everything came down there. And I want to tell you the truth about how that felt, because you would expect the collapse of the self to be the horror, the climax, the scream. And it was not. That is the last thing the Ridge taught me, and the strangest, and I have never gotten anyone to believe it. And I have stopped trying. But I will say it to you plainly, and you may do with it what you will. When the wall came down, what came was not terror. What came was rest. There came a point, and it came quietly, the way everything came quietly up there. No thunder, no revelation with a capital letter, just a slow settling like snow when I understood that fighting the thing was the last vanity. That a man struggling against a current is still insisting he is separate from the water, still saying I am not this river, and that the struggle is not the opposite of drowning, but a form of it, the loudest form. And I saw that the men before me, who had struggled, the man who taped his pad shut, which was me, the man who resolved to burn it, the man who walked clockwise to prove he was not himself, the man who filled the margins of a stranger's novel with a warning meant to reach forward across the years. Tell the next one it doesn't. They had all been doing the same thing I had been doing, which was clinging with the last of their strength to the beautiful and terrible idea that they mattered as individuals. That their particular guilt was theirs alone and precious. That the record they kept was a wall between them and the void, and not, as it truly was, a road running straight into it. And I was so tired. That is the part no one tells you about the end of a thing like this. It does not arrive as horror. It arrives as tiredness, as the specific bottomless tiredness of a man who has been holding a wall up his whole life and is finally allowed to set it down. And the setting down feels, God forgive me. It felt like mercy. It felt like being forgiven. Not by anyone, just forgiven. The way the ground forgives the thing that finally falls to it. So on the last clear evening before the snow closed the fire road, I did the thing the pad had been waiting for me to do. And I did it freely. And I want you to understand what I mean by freely, because it is the Ridge's final cruelty and its final mercy, and I still cannot tell the two apart. It let me do the last thing as my own choice. It did not compel me, did not seize my hand, did not move me like a puppet, and so I cannot even say it made me, cannot even keep my damnation clean, cannot stand before you and claim I was a victim taken against my will, because I was not taken, I walked, I chose it, and the choosing was as much mine as anything I have ever done. And that is the whole point. That is what the Frost Knight sentence meant. The Ridge didn't make you a man who watches instead of lives. It just gave you a clean place to do it. It did not make me the last handwriting. It only gave me the pen, and I was always going to pick up the pen. Because picking up the pen instead of turning to the living thing is the one act of my whole life. The act I did in that quiet kitchen, and the act I did up on that ridge. The same act, my love, and my defect. And they are the same, and they always were. I took the pad downstairs. The snow had not started yet, but you could feel it coming. The sky gone that heavy, waiting white. The light through the small window, not red now, but a flat pewter that had no warmth in it at all. I knelt in the soft corner where the board had sprung, where I had knelt so many times, where the man who patched the leak in a hurry had knelt, where all of us had knelt. And I lifted the board, and I did not put the pad back the way I had found it. Not yet. First I turned to a fresh page, the first blank page after the last thing I had read, and I sat there in the pewter light with the cold coming up through the floor into my knees. And I uncapped the blue pen, and I underlined the date twice, because a thing written without the double underline can be doubted, and I would not have the next man doubt me. And I began to write the entry for the next man. I wrote it in block capitals. I told him about the radiator, because a radiator that is going to fail will fail the same way for every man. And he should not waste the socket wrench. He should let it go cold. He will heat the upstairs with kerosene and it will be enough. I told him he would walk clockwise and think it saved him. I told him he would keep his status calls and build his tight small world and believe, for about 3 weeks, that he had gotten far enough away to be safe. I told him he would ask Hollis, or whatever the voice's name is by then, There is always a voice. There is always a tired man at a desk who has learned that answering the question straight has never once helped he would ask about 3 weeks in, and the voice would not answer him straight, out of mercy, and the mercy would not save him either. I told him the pad would run one day ahead, and that he would make a rule, some rule, his own version, tape or fire or something I could not guess, and that he would break it on the night of the first frost when he found himself kneeling at the board for a reason he had invented. And I told him what the pad would say to him then, not the words, because I could not know his words. His frost night sentence would be about his own life, his own quiet kitchen, his own folded small thing that he had carried up the mountain, believing he had left it behind. But I told him that whatever it said, it would be the truest sentence anyone had ever written about him, in his own hand, about the thing he had done that he had never told a living soul, and that it would be true, and that the truth of it was the whole trap and the whole freedom both. And then, at the bottom, below all of it, I wrote the only line I could still believe was mine, the only line I was choosing rather than reciting. Though even as I wrote it, I understood I want to be honest to the last, that it too was already there, worn into the groove, written by the man in the margins and the man before him, and the man whose initials are smoothest of all, that my one free line was the most worn line of all. The line every one of us has reached for at the end. The line that is the last flare of the wall before it comes down. I wrote, "Stop reading, go call someone. There is still time to be a person instead of a record. You won't, neither did I. But I had to write it because writing it is the only way I know how to love anyone, and that is exactly the problem." Then I capped the pen. I laid the pad flat on the dust and the gray insulation in the exact place I had found it, oriented the way it had been oriented, because I am careful, because I have always been careful, because being careful is the thing. I set the board back down over it. I pressed the sprung nail down with my thumb until it held, and it held. And I knelt there a moment longer with my thumb on the nail, and I thought about the man who patched the leak in a hurry. And I understood him completely. I understood the hurry. It was the hurry of a man who has just closed the floor over the pad and cannot bear to be near it 1 second longer. And I got up and I went upstairs into the last of the pewter light. And I made coffee in the steel percolator with all the worn initials in its base. And while it perked, I ran my thumb once over the smoothest set of grooves, the ones worn down to a memory of a carving, the ones I had sworn I would not touch again. And I touched them. And I added my thumb to all the thumbs, and I did not try to read them anymore, because I knew now whose they were. They were mine. They were all of ours. There was never more than one man on Sifton Ridge, worn smooth and written over and carved fresh, season on season, gate on gate, and I was him, and he was the next one, and the next one is you. If you ever drive up a fire road 11 miles past the last pavement and feel, kneeling on a soft floor, that first clean flush of pleasure, here is a record. Here is a letter from a friend. I took the coffee out onto the catwalk. The snow had started very lightly, the first of it, coming down through the blue dusk without any sound at all, filling the valley the way the fog had filled it on my first clean morning, filling the basin. And I stood there and watched it come down over the 4 counties, and I logged it. Of course I logged it. I went in and I wrote in my own log, my official log, the one the service will find, 2140. First snow, light, no wind. Date underlined twice. And I came back out and I stood in it. And I was not afraid anymore. And I have thought a great deal since about why I was not afraid. And it is this. You cannot be afraid of becoming a thing you have already been your whole life. The ridge did not change me. It never changes anyone. It only holds up a record in your own hand and waits with the patience of stone for you to read at last the entry you have been writing since the worst morning of your life. And then it lets you go on writing it, freely, forever, which is the only afterlife it offers, and the only one, I have come to think, that a man like me was ever going to get. I am not a witness to the horror on Sifton Ridge. I want that to be the last thing, the thing you carry out of here. I am not the man it happened to. I am its most careful author, and I always was, from the quiet kitchen forward. And somewhere under a floorboard 11 miles past the last paved road, there is a green steno pad with a fresh entry in it. In blue ink, block capitals, the date underlined twice, waiting for the next man to come cold and hopeful up the fire road and kneel in the soft corner and lift the board and feel, God help him, that first warm flush of pleasure. He will not know the entry is from me. He will look at the handwriting and he will think it is his own, and he will be right.